Hi guys, today we're going to talk about garage remotes. Let's go. Okay guys, so let's start talking about garage remotes. From my experience and from what I've seen in terms of content being produced either on YouTube or on other content platforms, and even by just talking to people, it seems to me that people not always seem to understand what's really going on around this topic of garage remotes. And given that we all have to interact with them sooner or later in life with these little things, I thought this would be a good opportunity to try and give my contribution in order to help people to be more knowledgeable and informed about this topic. Okay, so without further ado, let's go. Okay, so how do these things, generally speaking, operate? Okay, because they are more or less, in terms of general operation, the same thing, more or less. So a garage remote has inside a radio transmitter, radio frequency transmitter. They usually operate within specified and well-known frequencies. Okay, here in Portugal, for instance, it's very common to see the 433 megahertz frequency being used for these kinds of devices. And the way they work is they have several buttons, okay, on the plate. Each button is completely independent from one another, and when you press the button, the garage remote sends a code via radio frequency, using that radio frequency that we talked about previously, for example 433 megahertz, and it sends the code to the garage opener, which in turn has a radio frequency receiver. He receives the code. He then validates if the code is accepted or not to open the garage door. If it is accepted, the garage door opens. If not, it doesn't do anything, and that's basically it. Okay, so now regarding the different types of garage remote systems, okay, basically we have three big systems, okay, that range in terms of security, okay, and that range of security is represented here in this diagram by this blue arrow, okay, from the least secure system to the most secure system, okay. So here on the left, we have the least secure of them, which is the fixed code system, okay. We will be talking about each and every one of these in more detail in just a minute, okay. Next, in an intermediate security level, we have the learning code system, okay. And finally, we have the most secure, at least from my knowledge, the most secure garage remote system, which is the rolling code garage remote system, okay. Okay, so let's start with the first type of garage remote, the fixed manual code garage remote, okay. We have a picture of one of them here, okay. Usually these kinds of devices, garage remotes, use codes that are measured in bits, okay. So in this case, the code size has typically from 8 to 12 bits in length, okay. It's a manual code, meaning that you have to manually specify the code for both all of your remotes and for the garage opener, okay. It has to be the same code everywhere, okay. They have to be in sync, and you basically specify the manual code using these dip switches here, these little plastic switches that basically range from 0 to 1, so that you can specify the value of of each bit of the code. Okay, if you want all zeros, you put all of the switches down. If you want all ones, you put all of the switches up. Okay, don't forget that this is a binary code. Okay, and each bit has only two values, either 0 or 1. Okay, if you had a 12-bit remote, you would have 12 switches to specify each of the bits for the code. Okay, in terms of code possibilities, with for instance with the 12-bit system, we can get 4096 possible unique codes. Okay, and the math is as follows. You take your code alphabet, in this case it's a binary alphabet. Okay, so a binary system has two elements, a 0 and a 1. Basically the math is 2 to the power of the number of characters of the code. Okay, and this is a 12-bit code. Okay, so it's 12 characters long, your code. So it's 2 to the power of 12, and that gives us 4096 possible unique codes. Okay, which unfortunately is very limited and very easy to hack with brute force attacks. And that brings me to the pros and cons of this kind of remote. Of course, this is the least secure of them all. Okay, the only pro, if I had to pick a pro, would be that the code is mutable, meaning that the user can change the code like a password anytime the user wishes. Okay, nevertheless, the code has to be changed in all the remotes and on the garage opener at the same time, or else they won't be in sync, they won't work together to be able to open the door. Okay, cons, this is extremely weak against brute force attacks, as we will soon find out. Regarding pairing, so pairing one of these fixed manual codes remotes with your garage door opener. Basically the process, given that it's a manual operated code, it's exactly the same on both sides. So you do have the same number of switches on the garage door opener as you do on your garage remote, so that you can input exactly the same code on both sides, so that when you are sending the code from your garage remote, it is correctly recognized and validated by your garage opener. And that's basically how you pair fixed manual codes. Okay, now let's see a small example of the regular usage pattern for these kinds of remotes. Okay, so on the right here I have a small diagram representing the garage opener on the top. On the bottom we have the garage remote, and here the dashed arrow represents basically the radio frequency communication between them. And on the right here in quotes we have the code that is being sent over that radio frequency transmission. Okay, one more thing I need to address. I'm not going to show any code examples in binary format. Okay, I'm going to use the decimal system base 10 because I do think that it will be more comprehensible for most people. Okay, but the system works exactly the same. Okay, it's just a matter of numerical presentation. Okay, these are still valid examples, whether you are using binary format or base 10 format, hexadecimal format, it really doesn't matter. Okay, so now let's get this thing to work. So let's imagine our fixed manual code is set up to send the code 1 2 3 4. Okay, so first I'll get my remote, I press the button, it will send the code 1 2 3 4 over to the garage opener. Okay, the garage opener itself will also be configured to the code 1 2 3 4. So the thing the garage opener has to do is, when it gets the code, he will check if that code he received is the same as the code that it is configured to. In this case, the codes do match and it will open the garage door. If the code didn't match, it would do absolutely nothing. And that's basically it. Okay, now that we already know how this kind of garage remote works, let's talk about its vulnerabilities, okay? And the biggest one of them is the proneness to brute force attacks, okay? What's a brute force attack? Basically, a brute force attack is when the attacker that is trying to open your garage door will try out all the possible combinations of codes that your garage door accepts, okay? Basically, you will, on a more practical level, you will stand outside of your garage door with a radio frequency transmitter, okay? He will lock on to one of the several known frequencies, okay? As I said, these garage door frequencies are very well known, okay? One of them, for example, is the 433 megahertz frequency, okay? He can then lock to one of them and then cycle between them, okay? If one fails, he goes to the next frequency and tries again. But first he locks to a specific frequency, and then he will go through the range. In this case, it's a 12-bit system, so 2 to the power of 12 gives us 4096 possible codes, okay? And he just starts dumping out codes, okay, from 1 to 4096, and sending them through the radio frequency to the motor until he gets it right, and the motor says, oh, okay, that's the correct code, I'm going to open the door, okay? He's just sending 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 until he reaches 4096, and the motor will eventually react and open the door, okay? The big problem and why this fixed code system is so prone to brute force attacks, it has mainly to do with the very few combinations the code allows, because it's a very small code with only 12 bits in this example, okay? The bigger the code, okay, in terms of bit size, the bigger the number of combinations the attacker has to try out before being successful, okay? And as we will see next in the next types of garage remotes, that decreases this kind of attack substantially, okay, tremendously. Just to give you a notion, so for a 12-bit system, meaning 4096 unique possible codes, this can be easily tested in seconds. So you can literally in seconds open your garage door with an attack like this. Okay, so now on to the next type, the learning code, okay? Still a fixed code system, but now with learning capabilities, okay? So as you can see, this clearly tries to solve the problem the other one had by augmenting very significantly the code size in terms of bits, okay? The other one was 8 to 12 bits, this one is 32 to 64 bits, okay? So massive increase in terms of size, okay? This system loses the ability to manually define the code. I think maybe it's from a matter of practicality, because if you had to manually input the 64 bits, you would have to have like 64 individual switches inside the remote, which would make the remote very big, or you would have to use something like a a smartphone app in order to pair it with a remote and program the remote to have such and such code, but that also drives the costs up. So I'm just speculating here, but what I do know is that this is a fixed factory code. Okay, so each button, in this example we have a remote with 4 buttons. Each button is individual and has an individual factory set code. The advantage of this also is that because the factory is responsible for setting up set codes, the factory can also ensure, if they want to, I'm not saying that they do, but if they want to, they can ensure that each button in every remote that they produce has a unique code, and that code is never repeated again in any button on any remote. Okay, just to put things into perspective, let's see how the possible code size has changed. So before we had 8 to 12 bits, so 2 to the power of 12 was 4096 possible combinations. This time around we have 64 bits, so 2 to the power of 64. It's this ginormous number you see here, which in terms of the United States reads as 18 quintillion codes. 18 quintillion. Okay, this is because the US uses, I believe, for large numbers they use the small number notation. Okay, or the small number naming convention. We in Portugal use the large number naming convention, and so for us this is 18 trillion codes, okay, equivalent to yours 18 quintillion codes. It's the same number, it's just a naming convention thing. Okay, it's a lot of codes. Okay, it's a lot of codes. Okay, so pros and cons for this system. It statistically solves the problem of brute force attacks because it stops them in useful time. Okay, it's not unhackable, but it's unhackable in useful time, meaning when by the time you figure out the code, it won't be useful to you anymore. Okay, but unfortunately it is weak against replay attacks, and we will see this in a little bit in more detail. Okay, so now for the pairing system. So now that we don't have the ability to manually set the code either on the remote or on the garage opener, okay, basically what was done was they fitted the garage opener with a memory bank to store valid acceptable codes for opening the garage door. Okay, and basically what you do is and this varies from manufacturer to manufacturer, but all of them have this kind of functionality, the pairing or learning functionality, if you will. Okay, so basically what you do is you put the garage opener in pairing mode, and basically it is now listening on the specified frequency for any code that comes in, and any code that comes in, it will store it in its internal memory, stating that that is a valid code for opening this garage door. Okay, so put the garage opener in pairing mode. After that, select which of these buttons you want to pair with that specific garage remote. Remember, each button has a fixed code set by factory. Okay, and you press the button, you send the code up to the garage opener. The garage opener, which is in learning mode, receives the code, stores it in its internal memory, and the pairing is done. Now, from now on, that code is acceptable to open that garage door. Okay. Okay, now for a simple usage scenario of this system. Okay, so over here on the top right, we have a representation of the internal memory of the garage opener. In this case, it already has two paired garage remote buttons, okay, each one with their own specific code. These are very large codes now because we are using a 64-bit system, okay. That's why we have these 3 dots at the end, okay, stating that the number goes on and on and on, okay. And I grab my garage remote, I press a button, it sends the code. For instance, let's imagine this button is the code 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 etc etc etc. He sends or the remote sends the code, the garage opener gets the code. He then proceeds to check if that specific code is stored inside its internal memory. If it is, the garage door opens. If it's not, it doesn't do anything. That's it. Okay, so now let's see how this kind of system can protect us against brute force attacks. Okay, so now we have the same attacker from before. Okay, so he's trying to brute force his way into our garage. Okay, and so he's going to start sending codes incrementally and try to guess what the code is. So 1 2 3 4 5 up until 18 quintillion. Okay, and that's the problem, because he will need to spend a few decades or centuries, depending on the kind of processing power he has, to try and get it right. Okay, so it is hackable, but it's not hackable in useful time. Okay, and this notion of useful time is really important, because when it means that when he does hack it, it won't be useful for him. Okay, for example, if he can hack my garage in, say, 200 years, okay, congratulations, you opened my garage, but really I don't even know if my garage is still here 200 years from now. Okay, do you see where I'm getting at? Okay, actually this notion of useful time is one of the centerpieces of our current cryptography and security landscapes that protects us even today in the internet. Okay, it's the notion that the systems can be hacked, but if they cannot be hacked in useful time, that's good enough. Okay, perfect, problem solved. No more brute force attacks. Wait a second, when some problems go away, others appear to replace them, and in this case we have a new vulnerability, which is the replay attack. Okay, basically it consists on the attacker, now that just trying out different combinations is off the table, because it would take the attacker decades or centuries. Okay, now the real question is, okay, I need to grab one of the valid codes, okay, so that I can transmit it for myself whenever I want. Okay, and this is in fact possible. How does the attacker achieve this? Well, first off, when you are sending your code via radio frequency to the garage opener, you are not sending it in a linear path. Okay, that's not how radio waves work. Okay, actually they work much more like a circular pattern. Okay, centered around your transmitter, your remote control. Okay, and so anyone with a radio frequency receiver inside that action radius can in fact listen to the same code that the garage opener is listening. Okay, because your code is being sent everywhere inside that circular pattern. Okay, and so that's exactly what the attacker does. Imagine this case: you are returning to your home, okay, from work, for example. You stop by the garage door, okay, and you fetch your garage remote, and the attacker is, for example, parked inside of a car relatively near your garage opener. Okay, not near enough so that you can spot him, but near enough so that he can listen to your radio transmission. Okay, and so when you press the button, both his radio receiver and the garage opener receiver will both receive the code. And so the attacker gets the code, stores the code, and then he can just drive off and come back at a later date, or later in the night, or at early hours in the morning, and just replay the code and the door will open. It's that simple. Okay, so now we get to the most secure of them, which is the rolling code. Okay, which, as the name suggests, basically works by rolling the code on each button press. Okay, so instead of the code being fixed, every time you press a button, a new code is generated and sent to the garage motor. Okay, this is what basically makes the replay attack useless, because the codes can only be used once. As soon as that code is used, that code is never used again. So if the attacker captures your code and resends it after you already used it, the garage door won't open. Okay, but we will see an example, a more specific example of that next. More characteristics. This uses a 64 to 128 bits size code. Okay, so they took the opportunity and increased the size of the code. Bigger size means better robustness against brute force attacks, as we already saw. Okay, I'm not sure if there are even higher systems with higher bit count. Maybe there are, but at least 64 and 128 bits, I'm sure there are. Okay. Fun fact, this is also used to open car doors. Okay, so the car remotes also use rolling codes. Okay, so the pros, it solves the problem of the replay attacks, but unfortunately there is a new kind of attack, which is the man-in-the-middle attack. Okay, so it's someone that tries to disrupt the proper communication between the user and the garage remote and the garage door opener. Okay, we will talk about that in a bit, but unfortunately the man-in-the-middle attack breaks the rolling code. Okay, the silver lining to this is that the man-in-the-middle attack is a much more sophisticated attack, meaning much more difficult to successfully implement by an attacker. Okay. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit more in detail about how these rolling code systems work, because they are very, very different from the previous ones. Okay, so basically the rolling code system generates a new code each time you press the garage remote button. Okay, one press, new code, one press, new code, and the old codes never return. Okay. So that is represented here by the code equals F counter. Okay, so basically this code is generated by a cryptographic function, F in this case, and the input is the always incrementing counter, always incrementing when we press a button. Okay, and so basically what we do is, to generate a new code, we increment the counter, we put the counter as the input for the cryptographic function, and it spits out the 128-bit code. Okay, each and every time. Okay, this means that both the remote and the garage door opener must be synchronized in terms of the counter, so that they can generate the same code, and the codes can match for the validity of the code to be confirmed and for the door to be able to open. Okay, because the garage opener has the same algorithm than the garage remote. Okay, it needs to have the same counter synchronized with this. So what happens is, when I press the button, the counter is incremented. Okay, for example, imagine the counter for button A is 20. I press A, it increments to 21. It inputs this 21 into the cryptographic function, and out comes a 128-bit code. That 128-bit code is transmitted via radio frequency to the motor, okay? And the garage opener, upon receiving that code, he also receives the identification of the button that was pressed to generate that code. He then goes into his memory and gets the for that particular button, he gets the current counter value, okay, which in this case it was 20, because over there in the motor it wasn't yet incremented. It will increment to 21, it will put that as an input to the same cryptographic function, and out will come the same 128-bit code. You will then match that generated code with the code that you received via radio frequency. If they match, the door opens. If they don't match, it doesn't do anything, okay? And because the counters were incremented, even if an attacker listens to the 128-bit code and sends the same code to the motor will then generate the next code using the next counter value, which is different from the code that he received from the attacker. And so old codes don't work. Only future codes work, okay? So that's basically how this system works. For the system to be able to work in such a robust fashion in terms of security, F needs to be a cryptographic function, and this means it has several very important security properties. For me, the two most important ones are that similar inputs or near inputs, okay? Don't forget that the counter is an always incrementing value, so values that are very near to one another, so 1, 2, 3, 4, those are very near values, put out very distinct and very distant and very different results, okay? This means that you cannot correlate the outputs with the inputs, okay? You cannot find a pattern where you know that, okay, I know that because these outputs are similar, then the inputs must be similar. You cannot correlate this, okay? This is a very important property. The other very important property, in my opinion, is there is no inverse function, okay? Meaning you cannot obtain the counter from the code, okay? Cryptographic functions usually only work one way, from A to B. You cannot derive another function that goes from B to A, okay? So this means that the real secret here is not the algorithm, it's not the code, it's the counter, it's the input. That's the secret, okay? Because the algorithm can also be a public algorithm. Of course, it can be a proprietary secret algorithm, but eventually it will come out, okay? So the real secret is not the algorithm, is the input of the algorithm, which in this case is the counter, okay? So as long as you keep that counter a secret, the attacker has, because of those properties that I've just mentioned, has no way of reverse engineering the code into knowing what the counter was, even if he knows what the algorithm was, okay? So that's basically how rolling codes work. Okay, now let's talk about pairing them. So how do we pair these systems? So as we already know, the secret is the counter, okay? So we need to have a counter for each one of the buttons because they are all independent buttons. And this information must be stored in the garage opener so that he can then use the same algorithm to generate the codes and validate if the codes are the same, okay? So basically the garage opener memory is now composed of a table, okay, with two columns. The first column is the identifier of the button, and the second column is the corresponding counter for that button. And now this thing also has memory, because this also needs to store the individual counter for each button, because every time you press it, it needs to increment the counter, generate a new code, and send a new code, okay? So I would argue that the memory inside here is basically the same, or at least equivalent to the memory inside of the garage opener, okay? So now how do we pair them? So first off, you put the garage opener in pairing mode as usual, and that means that it will be listening for a button identifier and the current counter for that button. Okay. Then you also need to put the remote in pairing mode, because now the remote has two modes. The normal usage mode, where you press a button, it generates a new code and sends the code, and the pairing mode, where it will send not the generated code, but the button ID and the current counter for that button, which is exactly the information that needs to be stored in the garage opener. Okay, so and this of course changes from manufacturer to manufacturer, but imagine that to put it in pairing mode is to like wait for 5 seconds when pressing a given button. Okay, you press it for 5 seconds and it enters pairing mode. Okay, so as it enters pairing mode, now when you press the button, it will not send a generated code, it will send the current button identifier and the corresponding counter. Okay, so from the top, put the garage opener into pairing mode. Okay, put this into pairing mode, press a button, it will send the current button ID and counter value over to the garage opener. The garage opener will store that value, both the button identifier and the counter value, and the pairing is done. And they are in sync. Both of them have the same button identifier and the corresponding counter, meaning that when I press the button, this will increment that counter, generate the code using the cryptographic algorithm, send the code over to the garage opener. The garage opener, upon receiving that code, it also receives the button identifier, very important. Okay, so when I press the button, it sends two pieces of information, the button identifier and the corresponding generated code. The motor then gets the button identifier, goes over to their internal memory banks and gets the current counter, increments the counter, uses the same cryptographic algorithm to generate the corresponding code and see if the codes match. If the codes match, the door will open. If the codes don't match, the door will not open. And that's basically how you do pairing. Okay, so now let's try and follow a concrete example in more detail. Okay, I have the same table that I used previously, but I added 2 extra columns, one for the garage opener counter and one for the remote counter. That way you can follow the evolution of both counters in their internal memories respectively. Okay, so they have been both paired up. And let's assume that this button is button X, which we'll use for this scenario, and the internal counter is 23. Okay, and given that they are both paired and synced, both of them have in their internal memories the same value, X equals 23, the counter. Okay, so let's start. I'm going to get my remote, press the X button. Okay, when I press the X button, the remote will increment the X button's counter. It's this cell, this green cell over here. Okay, 23 incremented to 24. Then it will use the internal cryptographic algorithm, using 24 as the input to generate the 128-bit code, very big code, so that it can send that code to the garage opener. Okay, and that code here is 98765, etc. A very big number. Here is it's represented using decimals. Okay, but that's just for simplicity. And he then sends this code along with the identifier for the button. Okay, so he sends X and then the 98765, etc. This is important because the garage opener needs to retrieve the correct counter for the specific button, so it needs to know which button was pressed. That's why we send also the button identifier along with the 128-bit code. Okay, so now on the garage opener side, upon receiving the button identifier and the code, it will look up the current counter value for that button, the current counter value for that button, which currently is 23. Okay, it will increment it to 24 and do the exact same thing. So go and get the same cryptographic algorithm, feed 24 into the cryptographic algorithm and calculate the code. In this case, the code is exactly the same, 98765, etc. Then it compares the code it generated with the code that it received via radio frequency, and if they are the same, the door will open. Okay, that's basically it. And this is also why replay attacks are solved, because at the end of this, both counters were incremented by 1. They are no longer 23, they are both 24, meaning that the next time I press this button, it will generate a completely different code. So the code 98765, etc. will no longer be able to be used. Okay, rolling codes only allow for future codes, not past codes. That's why the replay attack, which is based on replaying past codes, won't work here. Okay, that's it. Okay, now quickly in more detail, let's look at the same example we were just describing. Okay, so the attacker grabbed our rolling code, okay, the X98765, etc., and it drives away, and then it comes back at later hours of the night and tries to replay the code. Okay, tries a replay attack. So let's see how that pans out. Remember that now the garage opener, the counter incremented from 23 to 24. Okay, when the user correctly used the 98765 code. Okay, now the attacker tries to use the same code again, but now the counter starts at 24. So let's see what happens. The garage opener receives the button identifier and the code. It grabs from its internal memory the current counter for that button, which is 24, increments it 25. Now calculates the code using the algorithm N25 as an input, and the output, imagine, is something like 46820, etc. A very big number, but very different from the previous one. Okay, and now the garage opener compares the two codes, the 98765, etc., with the 46820, etc. The codes are different, so it doesn't do anything, and the counter rolls back to where it was previously at 24. This is a very important part, okay? The counter only goes forward when a correct code was identified, okay? Or else it will remain in the same counter value, okay? So that's basically how it works. Okay, now let's talk about some limitations, because although great as it is, the rolling code still has its limitations and vulnerabilities. And the biggest limitation for me is the out of sync problem. Okay, this happens when the internal counter from the remote gets desynchronized from the internal counter of the garage opener. Okay, for example, if you take your remote with you to somewhere away from your house and start playing with it and pressing buttons, or one of your children maybe pressing buttons for fun, okay, each time you press a button, the internal counter will increment, okay, but the counter on the garage opener stayed the same, so they are desynchronized. Okay, imagine, for example, that you clicked 10 times on the button. So it was on the counter 24 previously, okay? So now it's at 34. And now you come home and you try to open your garage door. What happens? You click the button, it will increment from 34 to 35 and generate the code corresponding to the counter 35 and sends that code. The garage is still at 24 in its internal counter for this button. It will increment the button from 24 to 25 and generate the code for the counter 25. and the codes are different. One is code for 35, the other one is the code for 25. The codes are different, the garage won't open. And you are like, what the hell is going on? I can't open my garage door. The code, the elements are out of sync, okay? A partial solution for this, which is typically what is implemented, is a synchronization window, okay? It's a synchronization buffer, okay? So what this means is that actually the garage opener won't just try the next code, the next counter. It will try a series of counters up to a limit, okay? And that limit is known as the synchronization window, okay? For instance, here in this table, I added the synchronization of 20, okay? This is variable, okay, and depends from manufacturer to manufacturer. But this means that you may press up to 20 times on the button and it will still be able to resynchronize itself, okay, if it doesn't leave this window, this buffer size, okay? If you pass this buffer, you will have to repair, okay, to pair it once again with the garage opener, and it will override the previous counter value and put the current counter value, okay? But let's see an example on how the sync window can actually auto-synchronize both of them without having to repair both of them, okay? So imagine you went away and pressed 10 times on this button. So you have a counter that is 10 times larger than the counter that is on your garage opener, okay? Now, when you come over to your garage opener and press the button, the garage opener will try all counter values, starting from the value it has stored up to that value plus the synchronization window. In this case, it will try up to 20 values over the value that it has stored, okay? And obviously, because you only pressed 10 times, 10 is within the synchronization window, so it will be able to resynchronize itself. After trying with 10 different future codes, this only works with future codes, not with past codes. After 10 tries incrementing the counter, the garage remote is able to confirm that your code is a valid future code, and it will save that counter value, in this case 35. It will save that counter value and update it in its internal memory, and they are in sync again, okay? So that's basically how out of sync problems arise. Okay, so to finish our rolling code section here in our video, we have to address its vulnerabilities, and the vulnerability it is susceptible to is the man-in-the-middle attack. Okay, basically a man-in-the-middle attack is when you as an attacker put yourself between the source and the destination of a given interaction, okay? So you are able to control the interaction because you are in the middle. That's why it's called a man in the middle, okay? So how does this work? Basically, this will try to obtain a valid code, a future code. Don't forget that only future codes are valid codes in rolling codes, because past codes cannot be reused, okay? The goal of this attack is to obtain a valid future code that hasn't been used yet, but it is a valid code, okay? How does the attacker achieve this? So let's see. Let's take the example of our previous example that we were using, that we have both the garage opener and the remote both synchronized at x equals 23 counter, okay? And I'm the user, I'm right in front of my garage. There's the attacker in the car looking with their receiver, okay, and trying to capture codes. But not only the receiver, the attacker needs to have a radio signal interference generator or radio signal jammer, okay, so that the attacker can block the communication and all communication between my remote and my garage opener, okay. That way the attacker is able to control the communications that have to pass mandatorily by him, okay. So the only way, as you can see here in this little diagram, the jammer here in purple is stopping all radio communication between myself and the garage opener, but the attacker is able to receive the codes and emit those codes, okay, to the garage opener, okay. So this channel over here, the man in the middle channel, is operating. The direct channel between me and my garage opener is compromised because of the radio signal jammer, okay. Okay. Okay, so let's follow a concrete example, shall we? So I'm trying to open my garage. I press the button, okay. So my internal counter here goes from 23 to 24. It calculates the code 98765 and sends the code along with the button identifier. The attacker turns on the jammer, and the jammer stops my communication from reaching my garage opener. But at the same time, the attacker is able to receive my code, the X98765, and so the attacker stores that code. Meanwhile, I'm looking at my garage door and going like, oh, this didn't open. Maybe the batteries are dead or something, or maybe it's something in the air that didn't allow that to go through. I'll try it again because I really want to enter in my garage. This is basically how almost anyone would react to a situation like this. Oh, it didn't work, I'll do it again. And so I go ahead and I press the same button again. What happens is now I'm incrementing the internal counter of this remote again. So that's 2 increments, from 23 to 24 on the first press, and now for 24 to 25 on the second press of the button, okay? And this means that I generate a new code that I send. Of course, the jammer is on, so the code doesn't reach my garage opener as well. But the code does reach again the attacker, which now has 2 valid codes at his disposal, okay? And at the same time, the attacker sends the first valid code, okay? The 98765 sends the first valid code over to my garage opener, and the garage opens. And giving the sense that it was because of my second button press that the garage reacted correctly this time and started to open. And then I think, oh, okay, there it goes. At the second time, it worked, but it didn't. It was the attacker that relayed my first code, giving me the impression that it was because of me pressing a second time at the button that the garage door was opening, okay? And so I go on my merry way thinking all is well, and the attacker now has a valid future code, the X46820, because of my second button press, which has still not been used, and it is a future code, hence it's valid, okay? And so now the attacker can return to the late hours of the night, use that code. He can use it only once because the rolling codes are only valid for one single use, but in that single use he can successfully open my door and enter in my garage. And that's how the man in the middle attack works. Okay, we're almost at the end. I just want to talk very briefly about these duplicators slash cloner remotes. Actually, this is one of them, because I think there are very important misconceptions that need to be addressed in order for at least demystify some myths. Okay, so first, what do these things do? So this has a transceiver inside of it, so both a transmitter and a receiver. Okay, it needs to have a receiver so that it can listen when I'm copying code from another remote to here. It stores inside the memory, and then it needs the transmitter to send that code out again. Okay, they can copy fixed remotes, but they can only sync and replace rolling codes. Okay, so that's the first misconception, is that you can just clone a rolling code and that's it, and use both of them at the same time. You cannot. Okay, you cannot. It's true, you can synchronize both of them if this one has the same algorithm as this one, but the problem is actually what you're doing when you're pairing these two is you're sharing the button ID and the counter from the rolling code up to this one, and from this point on they are both synchronized. But what happens is when I start using this one, this counter will go up. Okay, this counter stays the same, and the garage opener counter will go up with this one, because this now is generating valid codes. And after that, if I try to use this one, you press the button, it will generate passed codes because the counter is lower. And passed codes, as you now know, on rolling code systems do not work. They are discarded. Okay, so basically you will have to press this button as many times as you press this one, just to make them in sync again. But after that, if you start using this one, this will be out of sync. Now this one is behind. Okay, and so you can use either one or the other, but not both at the same time. And that is a very important difference for instance, these fixed code systems. This is a learning code remote. Okay, because this one you can actually clone them and use this one and this one at the same time. I can give this one to a family member or a friend or something like that, and I don't have to retire my original remote in order to use this. Okay, with a rolling code that's not the case. I can only use this to replace this. For instance, imagine I have a rolling code that is really worn out, like the buttons are already breaking up, and it has some malfunction. It doesn't work as good as it once did. Okay, it has bad connections, etc. That is a good scenario where you can either buy a new rolling code, or if it's cheaper, buy a duplicator for rolling codes, pair them up, and retire this one and use only this one. Okay. Very careful when you are pairing these things up to garage remotes using fixed cloners or duplicators. Okay, with the rolling code ones, it's not a problem because they actually operate as an original remote. Okay, but not these ones. The problem with these ones is that they come from the factory, usually with the same generic code on all the buttons, and it's the same code for all the buttons and for all the remotes that were produced. Okay, for instance, imagine that the code is all zeros, 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0. Okay, for all the buttons. If you pair, but all zeros is a valid code. Okay, if you go on and pair a duplicator remote without first having duplicated an original remote, okay, what happens is you will pair the code 0 0 0 0 0 all zeros as an acceptable code to open your garage opener. Okay, this means that after you pair the first button, now all of your 4 buttons can open that garage. Even worse, if a neighbor of yours bought the same remote from the same company, it will most likely be pre-programmed with the same 0000 code. This means that now your neighbor can just try and press the buttons and it will open your garage door. Okay, so be very, very careful when pairing cloners with garage remotes. For me, I always advise pair originals only, because these always have the unique code inside of them. Okay, your originals only, and then after that clone the original. Okay, and now no pairing is necessary because the original was already paired. You are sending the same code, the garage will open just fine, don't worry about it. But if you really have to pair a cloner with a garage opener, please ensure that first you have cloned the original remote. Okay, okay, pros and cons. So pros and cons, same as the pros and cons as the remotes you are cloning, obviously. And the other one is that when we're talking about rolling codes, you cannot actually clone them per se, because you cannot use them at the same time. You can only replace them. Okay, so that's an important distinction. Okay, how does cloning usually works? This basically works by putting the transceiver inside in receiver mode. Okay, and it will pair just like a regular garage opener would. Okay, so I put this in cloning mode. I select the button where I want to put the code. At the same time, I press the button here that sends the code, and this will save in this button that I selected the same code that it received from here. From that point on, I put the transceiver back on transmitter mode, and now when I press the button, it will transmit the code it previously cloned. Okay. When we're talking about rolling codes, it's the same thing, but instead of saving the code, it will save the button ID and the counter. Okay, and that's it. I hope this was useful to you. Please share your ideas and opinions in the comments. And if you want to stay up to date with my new content, subscribe to the channel and click on the like button. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.